Parks and River Committee on the Los Angeles City Council. I am joined by colleagues David Rue, Paul Koretz, and Bob Blumenfield. We will officially begin this meeting. What I have are comment cards on every item from one individual, including a general public comment, and that is Mr. Wayne Spindler. So, Mr. Spindler, please step forward. And you have 2 minutes to speak on the items and then 1 minute to speak on general public comment. And let's begin his time.
Okay, thank you. And for the record, Bob Blumenfield has decided to leave. Buck, 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 buck. So item number 1, Mr. John Worfs for the Cultural Heritage Commission. We don't know what the Cultural Heritage Commission, the Cultural Affairs Commission, that's not to be confused with the Cultural Heritage Commission. The Cultural Affairs Commission is the do-nothing version of the cultural commissions. The Cultural Affairs Commission actually doesn't exist. So we approve number 1, yes. Number 2, Charmaine Jefferson to the Cultural Affairs Commission. Yes, we agree she should be put on this non-existent body, this non-existent commission, not to be confused with the Cultural Heritage Commission, which meets here. Mr. Barron is the chair. That's a very important commission. The Cultural Affairs Commission is a do-nothing commission that does nothing at all, which is good. At least it doesn't hurt any of us people. Number 3, the Recreation and Parks resolution to the use of safe neighborhoods for pigs. Yes, we agree. Allow pigs to be in parks, yes. Number 4, Recreation and Parks, again, excessive funds for El Sereno Recreation. Actually, yes, I support that. I think that's in CD1. Mr. Cedillo needs the money. He needs another $3 million because of Friday's fuck up. You know about that. Finally, Taylor Yard. Fuck Taylor Yard. We don't want Taylor Yard. Fuck Taylor Yard. No on number 5. Then I get my 1 minute general.
So, we got Parks and Rivers. Gil Cedillo lost his bid to build our Cultural Commission facility in CD1 on North Figueroa because somebody forgot to file a piece of paper within the 10-year statute of limitations. No, I don't think so. I think there's a rat in the city attorney's office that stabbed Mr. Cedillo in the back because they thought Joe Braille was going to get elected 6 months ago. Who is it? Who in the city attorney's office put a knife in the back of Gil Cedillo? Anybody? We'll find out because I need something from Gil, and if he gives me something, then I'll tell him where to look. Follow the money. Give him back his land. It only costs $3 million. Otherwise, you're going to be dealing with 5 years of hell from that gentleman.
All right. So, colleagues, what I'd like to recommend is that we take items 1, 3, and 4 on consent if there are no objections. It's items 1, 3, and 4. All right, and that brings us then to item 2. If you would read the item, Mr. Sutton-Willis.
Item number 2, communication from the mayor relative to the reappointment of Ms. Charmaine Jefferson to the Cultural Affairs Commission for the term ending June 30, 2022. Ms. Jefferson is here, I believe.
Thank you. Ms. Jefferson, if you would please step forward. Thank you. And welcome. And let me, good morning. And let me just start by saying thank you for serving on the commission. And we appreciate your willingness to serve another term.
Thank
you. With that, please take it away.
I won't take much time. I just simply want to say thank you, first off, for the opportunity for the reappointment, and also to thank you for the support that you've actually given to the Cultural Affairs Commission. I know that in a week or so you're going to take up once again the work that they're doing with Embrace LA, and it's an extraordinary body of work, and our commission is looking forward to also doing all that we can to further support all those issues associated with equity and inclusion and diversity and access, and how we get there in Los Angeles with all of the other threats that are up against us in our state.
Wonderful. And you mentioned Embrace LA as a highlight. What are some of the other highlights that you've really kind of stand out in your work on the commission?
Well, I have the advantage of having served on the commission for a little while now, so I've seen a number of projects come into fruition. And the one I think that you can stop and be extremely proud of, I know we have a lot of work still to do, is just to watch the changes even at the international terminal. To have seen, as slight as they may be, but what it does in terms of the raising up of the level, the access, some of the new moves that are getting ready to go in. Our commission spends a lot of time trying to make sure that the aesthetics that are coming into our city line up with what it is that's good both for the public and for the buildings and the use that are there. But we also look at how we can be, and are looking forward to how we can be of more service to the city. You've got some great experts, both from architect and arts background and management and philanthropy and et cetera. And if there's more that we can do, we're happy to do it.
And I know that this committee, and it's something important to me professionally, and that is to generate additional resources for arts and culture in Los Angeles. What are some of, I think, from your perspective, some of our biggest opportunities to grow that?
Well, someone told me once, be leery of what you ask for, but just the other day, New York City came out. I used to be Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, Deputy Commissioner of Cultural Affairs for the City of New York, and I just looked up, and they just came out with a multi-million-dollar report where they're trying to invest in arts and entertainment in their city because they know how much it contributes to the city. It is a viable work opportunity, and that the city is becoming less affordable for artists and those who, in fact, then are part of the industry that then brings in the tourism. I'd say Los Angeles is probably a little ways away. We're not nearly as bad as Silicon Valley, which has, gotten ridiculous, but we're getting close. And for all of the industries that we bring into our city and that we shoot to make revenue, one of the things that they're looking at has to do with this affordable housing, particularly for those who are working. And the same thing, I know that the county is looking at this issue as well. So I think there's some opportunities for partnership on how we can create either more housing stock that then can be made available for artists as well as studio. From a funding point of view, there are a number of very large philanthropies, especially in our state, especially in the Silicon Valley, that ought to be doing some things in Los Angeles. We ought to continue to look to see how we can make that possible. There are a couple of other ideas, but Denya will tell you that I'm always seeing an idea and then sending it to her and saying, hey, do we think we ought to apply for this? So unfortunately, I feed her email.
That's terrific. I love that you have a perspective that takes a look at an economy that supports arts and artists. That's really refreshing. And it's one thing to push for resources to grow our profile in arts and culture, but I think it's an added benefit that you have that perspective of, well, how do we support an economy that really supports our artists? So that's appreciated.
I have to say that I am a big believer in the fact that government or the tribal leaders have a certain amount of responsibility for helping to maintain and preserve and promote the culture and the history and the art and the way we tell our story currently and in the future, and how we debate and come up with ideas and get creative. But they're not the only source. There has to be a balance so that it isn't just simply the aesthetics of the absolutely wealthy, and at the same time you should not assume that those who are the poorest among us are only interested in housing, because in fact if you want them to be as much a part of what we're doing, you have to engage in that too. So I can remember when we put together cultural programming for people living in temporary housing in New York City, and it combined it with the public schools and looking at issues of nutrition and the fact that people who were living in temporary housing didn't have the same advantages. At the same time, we looked at it from the point of view of marketing the city as a tourist occasion and how other businesses could be involved in this. So it's really got to be about partnership. I don't think that anyone engaged in the arts should simply think that it is only going to come from government funding, but it also means it has to be a combination of partnerships, collaborations across the board.
Mm-hmm. And I, for one, don't think that we should exclude land use policies with supporting work-live, affordable for artists. And, you know, I think as we move forward, that's something we can really take a close look at. If we, as policymakers, really believe in arts in LA, then we have to think outside that proverbial box and just realize that it's an all-in approach, even as it pertains to land use in some instances.
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons why the hotel tax is important. It's another reason why the percentage associated with the development of buildings is important. I think we all have a vested interest in what our city is going to look like in the future. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, even though I spent a lot of time on the other side of the country, and I got a chance to be in a leadership role in New York City. But I can tell you that Los Angeles has now come to a point where it actually values what we not only had in the past, but what we look like in the future, as opposed to just simply tearing it down. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of combination of mixed use is really, really, really important. I mean, I'm around long enough to be able to tell you when downtown was downtown, when it moved to Century City, when it's moving back, but our city is so large now that we have absolutely got to afford the opportunity that we see the arts not just as a downtown place, but all over the place. The entire city, the entire spectrum, the entire geography, which means that there's not just one museum or one dance company or one theater. At the same time, we have to recognize that in some instances there's got to be an access for voices that otherwise might not be able to afford the facility, but in fact then would keep the community engaged. And that's as well as not only engaged, but also working across cultures, across different ideas, across different landscapes as neighborhoods change. And I've seen several neighborhoods in this city change over the years, and invoke the following closing note. In December, Tom Bradley would have been 100 years old. And one of the legacies that he leaves behind is that he went to the Diligani family and said, we can't have Los Angeles not have any historic theaters. Now, I don't have a lot of friends I can just turn to and say, please go buy this building for me. Right. But in fact, they did. They were not in that business. And they got involved in it and then bought other theaters. And we have the State Theater and the Los Angeles Theater on Broadway to this day because government had conversations with private industry about how we needed to preserve that part of Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. That's a celebration of legacy that to this day still has effects all across our city. And it was a vision, like there were other visions. And as our council has done, as you've done with the Embrace for Race LA, you seeing the vision going forward, it's going to take some time, but it is collaboration.
Well, I, for one, appreciate your experience, your generosity in giving back, and your expertise on these issues on the commission. So thank you.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, questions, thoughts? Mr. Kretz?
Oh, I just have one just based on what you just brought up. I know we've saved the historic theaters on Broadway, but we haven't made them that functional because there's not enough parking, so they're often closed. And I'm not sure anyone is keeping an eye on that towards the possibility of actually making them successful so that they'll serve a function and not just be empty historic buildings. Is there any kind of a connection between cultural affairs and trying to bridge that gap and working with our planning folks and other folks to actually make sure we don't continue to reduce parking in that area rather than increase it?
Well, parking is certainly an issue, and you have surrounding parking in that area. I've actually produced a show at the Orpheum. I know that, which is across the street. I think that one of the issues is that Los Angeles still has to grapple with the fact that we can have both for-profit theater and nonprofit theater, for-profit uses and nonprofit uses in those facilities. I know of someone who's particularly interested in bringing in what would ultimately be a Broadway show into a theater in that location, so that Los Angeles is the kickoff place for a Broadway show rather than it necessarily coming out of New York. And I can tell you that most of the Broadway shows that come out of New York that get all of the Tony attention actually started in regional places. So there are opportunities for Los Angeles, I think, to do that. Now, as they build more buildings, and you have office buildings that once they vacate in the daytime, nighttime you have parking, then it's just a matter of being able to tell people where they can park. If we make all parking $30, we're going to start to make it so that no one goes anywhere because the parking's too high. And having run the California African American Museum next to the stadium and natural history and the science museum and et cetera, I can tell you what the impact can be on the use of public facilities when the parking gets, when the issue of money becomes almost more important rather than equal to the issue of how do we deliver to the public. It's a conversation to be had, but I think we ought to spend some time talking with some of our other neighbors who are producing in New York and Minneapolis and San Francisco and seeing about whether or not this issue of touring product here not only happens at the Music Center, but happens in other theaters all around the Los Angeles area.
And those would obviously be great theaters, and they even have the right name. They're on Broadway.
That's
So,
right. They are definitely off
place
Broadway.
for an LA Broadway show. But I think to the extent that it's not happening, we need to try and have that conversation between our cultural affairs folks and our planning folks to figure out how we actually provide enough parking for those facilities to become functional again, because they're great buildings and they would be a great host to those kinds of productions.
Well, I will not only take your concern in my head, but I am actually this afternoon with some people who actually have an interest in wanting to present at one of the theaters there. So I will be looking more closely at this issue of parking. When I produced something at the Orpheum, there was other parking in the area, but they've also taken down some parking to put up.
A lot of those surface lots are disappearing.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Rue.
I just want to quickly say, I mean, you're an artist yourself, you're an attorney, you're a former executive director of one of our pillar museums, the California African American Museum. So I just want to thank you for your service and your willingness to serve again. So I really appreciate your expertise.
It's my honor to do so.
Thank you.
Mr. Blumenfield.
And I'll just add my voice of support. You've been doing great work, thrilled about it, and excited that you're moving forward. We want to move you forward to continue the great work. I particularly like what you said about looking at the entire city, because I represent the area that's furthest to get to by car from here. And folks in my district often feel that we're getting the short end of the stick on a lot of things, and cultural arts is no exception. And there's actually a thriving community out in the West Valley that needs the support of the city, and that's often overlooked. So I appreciated your recognition of that need, and look forward to working with you as you move forward.
Thank you. I end up spending a lot of time doing work with folks out at Cal State Northridge, so just being on the other side of the mountain and uncovering every day all of the other activity that goes on that we don't see immediately in Los Angeles. And they, too, are ripe for saying, no, we're a part of Los Angeles, and it needs to be recognized. And a true force of that was just watching the mayor in the last couple of years do his State of the Union address at different places around the city and not just in what was the LA local. So when he did it in Cal State Northridge, it told the rest of Los Angeles, no, this is Los Angeles as well. So just thinking about it from that point of view, as well as how far out you go all the way to the beach, on one end west, San Pedro on the other end, you are right. I don't think people clearly understand that they could do a staycation just here in Los Angeles.
Right. Well, thank you. With no further comment, I think that this panel strongly supports your reappointment to the Cultural Affairs Commission. Seeing as there's no objection, we'll move you forward so you can get started on that next term.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much,
Or
Ms.
just
Jackson. Jefferson, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. All right, and that then brings us to item number 5. Mr. Sutton-Willis.
Item number 5, a verbal report from the Chief Legislative Analyst and the Bureau of Engineering relative to the status of the negotiations with the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy for a multi-purpose easement on a portion of the Taylor Yard G2 parcel and the state grant funds to offset costs associated.
Thank you so much. We are joined by Matthias Farfan of the Office of the Chief Legislative Analyst and Katie Doherty of the Bureau of Engineering. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, committee members, Chairman O'Farrell. As you mentioned, we're here today to provide you with the verbal status report of the ongoing negotiations with the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, MRCA for short, for their potential purchase of a multi-purpose easement on a portion of the Taylor Yard G2 parcel. Just to clarify, the agenda states the Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy. They are a member of the MRCA.
Right.
So at the end of the day, when the agreements come forward, the MRCA will be listed on them. Mm-hmm. On January 27, 2017, through the leadership of this committee and Councilmember O'Farrell, the council authorized city staff to complete the acquisition of the G2 parcel for the purpose of the Los Angeles River Ecosystem Restoration Project, the LAIR project for short. On March 1st, 2017, the city closed escrow for the purchase of the G2 parcel. It was purchased for $59.3 million plus closing costs, with $14.7 million of the purchase price set aside in a remediation escrow account to offset future costs associated with the soil remediation of the property. The city is currently obligated to remediate the property to an industrial use level because the G2 parcel has not yet been dedicated to the LAIR project. Future council action would be needed to be taken on agreements with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with an identified funding for the property to actually be dedicated for the LAIR project. The MRCA has offered to partner with the city to further the LAIR project. To this end, the council instructed the CLA with assistance of engineering, CAO, and city attorney to negotiate an agreement with the MRCA for a multi-purpose easement on a portion of the G2 parcel for the purchase price of $20 million. The funds for purchase would be awarded by the state's Wildlife Conservation Board to the MRCA, and then we would enter an agreement with the MRCA for those funds. City staff is currently engaged in negotiations with the MRCA and anticipates to conclude negotiations by August of 2017. The negotiations will result in agreements subject to the approval of the council and the Wildlife Conservation Board for the purpose of a perpetual multi-purpose easement on the Taylor Yard G2 parcel by the MRCA. The agreements will address the size and location of the easement area, the allowed interim uses within the easement area, and respective responsibilities between the city and MRCA regarding the operation, maintenance, and environmental remediation activities on the easement area. City staff anticipates, again, to complete these negotiations. It's probably be mid to late July. I'm sorry I stated August before, but it's mid to late July. When this occurs, we will report back to council with the proposed agreements for council consideration. This report back will also discuss how the proposed agreements address other current lessees and easement holders on the G2 parcel. These include pipeline and fiber optic operators. They have easements on the eastern border of Taylor Yard, or western border of it. Also, there's current users of roadways that are used to access, different parcels around Taylor Yard, and so it'll address that as well as Metrolink's use of an existing tail track that currently comes onto Taylor Yard, and Metrolink currently has an easement on the eastern border of Taylor Yard to build a replacement tail track. It is anticipated that the WCB will consider the agreements for the $20 million grant at the end of August. This concludes my report. We're here to answer any questions you may have.
All right. Anything to add, Ms. Doherty?
No, that covers it. I'm here for questions.
Okay, thank you. So this parcel, it's about 41 and a half acres,
Yes.
correct? And so what portion, percentage or acreage do you anticipate being under the regulation of the MRCA based on this agreement?
That's currently still under negotiations. On some of this, I'll be vague, since if you want to go into closed session at some future meeting, we can go to discuss the actual.
Because of the negotiations?
Yes, but right now, it seems it would be in the northern portion of the Taylor Yard G2 parcel. North of G2 is G1, which is referred as the bow tie parcel that's currently owned by the state. This easement, it is believed, would be in continuation of the bow tie, so it would be located on the northern portion of G2. The size of the easement area would be based on how much the property, the fair market value of the property is. Since this would be an actual perpetual easement, it would have to be on property that currently doesn't have any encumbrances on it, like the pipeline operators or roadways. Therefore, the fair market value for that property would be higher than what our purchase price was for Taylor Yard G2. So it could be anywhere from a quarter or up to a third.
And is one of the encumbrances, would it be considered the needed brownfield remediation? Is that also one of the encumbrances, or is it simply other easements running through? Is it limited to that?
Currently the property does need soil remediation. It currently does have contamination.
But not everywhere evenly. It's in spots.
It is. It is. And there are current hot spots. There are hot spots on the property. One where the proposed easement area is located, that is one of the hot spots. That's part of the negotiations with MRCA, would be how we're going to, the city and their remediation costs would be split. Again, the city's obligation to clean up Taylor Yard is only up to industrial level. If the city decides to execute this easement and it's for, let's say, open space, recreational, the cleanup costs would then be higher than industrial, because there would be higher cleanup that would be required. So that also needs to be negotiated in the agreement, how that would work.
And that's going to be one of my questions as well. But before I get to that, since MRCA is a state agency, is one of the goals to establish connectivity to the bow tie parcel?
I believe so.
Through this arrangement that we figure out?
There is, but it's State Parks owns the bow tie, and then this would be the MRCA. It's still a state agency, but it's a separate state agency, but that is their goal, to connect it.
And so my question about industrial use standards, aside from industry, what else could be put on land that is brought to industrial use standards? A pathway, a DG pathway? What kind of temporary use could we envision going in?
And that work has been begun by our Bureau of Engineering. I think Katie can handle that.
Yeah, that really is up to the discretion of the Department of Toxic Substances Control, what they would actually approve for industrial uses. It depends on the exposure of the people that will be on the site, so that's how they determine what types of uses. The way that they work is they usually have us propose a use, and they tell us if it's okay.
All right. And we're not to that point yet, because these negotiations have to take place first. But we are mindful of imagining what temporary uses we'd like to see, if we can get any on there at all, right?
Yes, and it's when we report back late July, early August regarding the proposed MRCA easement on Taylor Yard G2, I'm hopeful that our report would then include a discussion on options for Taylor Yard that would include what can be done in that easement area, as well as options for the remaining portion of Taylor Yard G2.
And however we land on this negotiation with MRCA, are the uses on those parcels or that percentage of the 41.5 acres, is that an exclusive use for MRCA, or will that be some sort of shared arrangement? I guess what I'm getting at is I am confident you're negotiating with the point of view of what's best for the city. And I would think that if it is legally possible to negotiate for a shared and non-exclusive use, but I don't know what the answer to that question is yet.
Well, we're still in negotiations regarding that point, but in discussions with MRCA, their goal is for the city to one day implement the layer project. So the agreements would state that if at some point the city does decide to move forward with the layer project, that they would allow the layer project to be built on this easement area. Regarding interim uses, if the layer project, let's say, is delayed or anything.
And Matthias, can you describe the layer project?
The layer project was, council adopted the Arbor study, I think a year ago.
There's so many acronyms.
Yes, it's the Arbor project, was the EAR, and then well, maybe you can answer it better.
The acronym that you're using is the LA River Ecosystem Restoration Project. That was the project that was conceptualized by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's a revitalization of the LA River. And Arbor is one of the other acronyms for the same thing.
Right.
I could tell you what that means, but
That's
it really
okay.
isn't important. It's basically, in the Taylor Yard area, it is creating habitat. So right now it's a contaminated industrial site. The idea would be to lower the level of the site, about 15, 20 feet, so that it's the same level as the river. So it becomes part of the floodplain, planting native habitat so that birds and whatever animals can come back, and then potentially incorporating some compatible recreation into the area, most likely passive type recreation.
And that's the long-term.
That would be done in partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and that's down the line.
And the layer project covers an 11-mile stretch of the Los Angeles River. Taylor Yard would be one of those reaches within the layer project.
And so we're probably several years away from that ambitious but reachable goal.
Yes.
So I'm really focused on interim plans. So for example, if we, once we strike the agreement with MRCA, they're going to move really fast, like they usually do. And I would want to make sure that we as a city think of interim use so that we don't have, a quarter or a third of the parcel being activated and then the remaining part is just growing weeds and doing nothing. So I think that's going to be important. And I think that's the lens perhaps to look through when we're talking about temporary uses with what is legally allowable, and then going to the board and, getting permission for that use. Have you all been thinking at all about in terms of that? Pathways, areas that people can, I don't know.
We have.
Plantings,
we have. Yeah, we, Bureau of Engineering came up with a very, very conceptual, just ideas of things that we could do on the site. We have, from the data that we have now, we've identified sort of the cleaner areas. So our idea would be to try and utilize those areas, do some further investigations, get those signed off by DTSC for the types of uses we're looking at, to be able to open those as quickly as possible, sort of fencing off or somehow separating the dirtier areas, or as funding becomes available, as the council approves for future actions in those areas, we can sort of do it in a phased approach, but with the idea of trying to get it open and accessible to the public as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And so there will be costs associated with securing the site.
Yes.
Yeah. And are those costs coming out of, here's another acronym, the LERDS line item? And I know that there was $900,000 set aside for funding for the acquisition piece. So might some of that sort of securing the site funding come from that?
Well, currently, with the closing of escrow, council authorized up to $60 million in MICLA commercial paper for the acquisition of Taylor Yard and any closing costs associated with the property. There were funds that were left over, some of which have been used by the Bureau of Engineering to secure the site, to put fencing around the site to make sure it's not accessible to people, to put up post signs. So there are costs associated with just maintaining the property. when we come back and report to this committee sometime late July, early August, it's my hope that our report will include some of that information. Getting back to your earlier question regarding the city's use of that easement area, if the city does decide to execute the multi-purpose easement for MRCA, the city will continue to be the owner of that property. It will just now have this overlaid easement, which will state restrictions on what can occur within that easement area. But the city is always free to do its own project within that easement area, so long as it conforms to now the restrictions that have been placed on it by the grant.
Right.
Can I'd like to add as well that the city was awarded about $2 million even from the State Coastal Conservancy to do site assessments and an interim plan. That's just a planning document for interim uses and for the long-term LARA project. So that has been secured. We do have $2 million there.
Oh, perfect. That's exactly kind of what I'm getting at. And will that be part of your report?
That would be, when we report back,
Or that'll be a separate report?
It may just have an overview, but the actual report that would be generated from these grant funds wouldn't be coming back until sometime in May or of next year.
On the grant itself, well,
Yes.
we've executed the grant. A motion came through a couple of weeks ago to execute the grant. So is that a report on what exactly?
As far as hiring the
the consultant? Yeah.
the consultant's report.
That would be, sometime early next year. We would be coming
Okay.
back with the results of that.
And so that legislatively has already been set in motion by this council?
Yes.
Okay, I might have even been on that motion, but I'm not even sure. But, okay, but at least that's been done.
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Well, that's great. All right, and then this verbal report is going to be a written report that's going to come out before recess, I understand.
Well, this one, no. The written report you would be receiving would be at the conclusion of our negotiations with MRCA.
Okay.
Which would be sometime mid to late July.
All right, so
hopefully
we
our
can
report will
expect
be-
a written report in mid to late July.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Terrific. And colleagues, so the whole area we're talking about is in Council District 1, and it's the Taylor Yard site and the big acquisition that we engaged in this last calendar year. So terrific. Colleagues, questions? Mr. Blumenfield?
Thanks. On the negotiations with the MRCA, has it been, I can't talk about too much of it in open session, but from last time we talked about it in December, I thought it would have been done sooner. Has there been a big holdup of some sort, or do you feel like it's progressing on the natural course?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the grant would be approved by the Wildlife Conservation Board. They meet quarterly. Their last meeting just took place, it was in June?
I think it was the end of May.
End of May. So their next meeting is scheduled for late August. And the process the state is following in order to award this grant is that they've performed their own appraisal of Taylor Yard G2 to assess what the fair market value is of Taylor Yard G2 according to the state. And that appraisal has also undergone a review by an independent appraiser that's been hired by the state to confirm the findings of the first appraiser. City staff have reviewed it. We're in agreement of the fair market value for the unencumbered portion of the property. If they were purchasing the entire property, that would be a whole other thing. But that has led to some delays as far as getting all that sorted out, because we're not only dealing with the MRCA, we're also dealing with the Wildlife Conservation Board staff as well.
But that's just in terms of getting the number. So from what I'm hearing then is the other details have kind of been worked out. It's just landing on the number.
It's landing on the number, and to clarify the responsibilities between the city and MRCA when it comes to remediation of the property. Since the city is legally obligated to clean it up to industrial level, then the agreements just need to be very clear that that's the city's obligation. But if now the easement triggers remediation that's above and beyond industrial, then how the cost of that additional remediation is covered.
And I guess that goes to my second concern. Was back in December, we talked about getting the report from the DTSC. And it sounded like at that point it was kind of imminent. They were going to give us some real feedback on what those remediation costs would be. And I hear what you're saying in terms of some of the remediation cost is based on what we propose. But I thought they were going to generically give us a report back that was, I thought back in December was pending. Have we gotten anything from them in the interim?
Well, their report would be largely based on what the city intends to do on the property. So the city would need to first specify to DTSC what we plan on doing on the properties for them to provide feedback. The property, G2, currently does have a state-approved remedial action plan to clean up the property to industrial levels. So the city is always has the option of just implementing the currently state-approved remedial action plan. That's why the cost back when we negotiated the purchase price of Taylor G2, the estimated cost to implement that plan was $14.7 million. Of course, costs increase every year just as a matter of delaying things, so the cost would be greater than that. But to clean it up to industrial use standards at this point, it involves pretty much putting concrete on a large portion of the property. Because it would be for industrial use, so it would be like a parking lot and then concrete slabs to put warehouses on.
I guess what I'm getting at in terms of DTSC, do we need to put added pressure on DTSC to act, or you feel like they're moving quick enough? Because we want to make sure we're doing everything we can as city family and as council members if extra pressure needs to be put to bear that we're not getting what we need from them. And I don't think I'm hearing that, but maybe I heard something different back in December. So,
I don't think that's necessary. They've been very helpful whenever we have questions. We've met with them several times. They're amenable to what we're trying to do. They have sent over a draft. It's a CLARA, California Land Reuse and Revitalization Act voluntary cleanup agreement. So they drafted that and they sent that over. We're currently reviewing that. That will be coming through your council as well for approval. And that's the first step. Right now we're under this, what's the name of it? Consent order. Basically, we're being inherited from UP, Union Pacific, the previous owner. We're being directed to clean up the site to industrial. This type of agreement that we're currently in negotiations with them for is a nicer one. It's a voluntary cleanup agreement that affords us some immunities in terms of us not being the generators of the contamination. So to answer your question, they've been very helpful so far. I don't think pressure is necessary.
Great.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Grutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question on remediation. So what were our negotiations like when we first purchased the property? Was the fact that we had to undergo significant remediation taken into account and in the valuation of the property, et cetera, et cetera?
It was, when we negotiated the purchase price of Taylor RG2, we came to an agreed upon value of the property if it were clean to industrial level. So if we were able to currently use the property for industrial purposes today, what would be the value? That's what the $59.3 million represents. We separately then, using the state-approved remedial action plan up to industrial use levels, we had our Bureau of Engineering review that plan and come up with the cost estimate of how much it would cost the city to implement that plan. And then they simultaneously, Union Pacific came out with their estimate of how much it would cost them to clean it up to that level. And then so that cost was also negotiated. That's what the $14.7 million in that remediation escrow account represents. And so was taken into account, but the city could have always have told Union Pacific to clean up the property to industrial, and then we would have purchased it. But since the purpose of the city acquiring G2 would be for the layer project, we would just have to undo all that remediation that was just done. So we would be, in effect, paying for remediation twice.
I'm not sure I understand why that would be.
When you remediate a property, let's say for industrial, it called for removing 2 to 5 feet of soil and bringing in a new soil and then capping it. And then so if we went ahead and did that, but now we came back and for the layer project, it required the city to remove, let's say, 15 to 20 feet of soil. The city would need to remove those 2 to 5 feet of soil and the concrete barrier that was just put in, let's say, 2 years ago.
Which would obviously be a waste of time. So did we get enough money to actually cover the cost of remediation?
To industrial use level, we did, but again, that was based on the negotiated value of the property at $59.3 million, which was already based on an appraisal that was already performed over 2 years ago, prior to the purchase of Taylor Yard. The remediation costs were also based on costs that are already over 2 years old. So the remediation to industrial use level today would be higher than the $14.7 million, but the purchase price would also be higher than what we purchased it for.
Now, if we're looking at a project that causes us to possibly take out 15 to 20 feet rather than just the industrial level, why were we only asking for the industrial level? Why couldn't have we asked for part of that portion to be done to a higher level?
Because the property is currently zoned for industrial use, and if the city did not purchase Taylor Yard G2, Union Pacific was always free to sell the property to a developer, and the developer could come in and already develop the property for an industrial use because it's already zoned. It's currently zoned for that purpose. So from their perspective, that was the only cleanup obligation they had, was to bring it up to industrial use.
So they basically sold it to us for what they would have sold it to a developer for under the same circumstance.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Rue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and really appreciate these updates. Very informative. I just had a quick question. I wanted to go back to the MRCA negotiations with Easement.
Yes.
So I remember a while back when you guys first came, the easement that the MRCA was asking for was like on prime location. Did that negotiation, can you disclose that? Did that get resolved, or do they still want the same easement?
No, I believe so. I think it's been resolved, and as I stated before, when we come back to this committee, when the council returns from recess, you'll actually see where it's located, and at that point, you'll get to decide whether or not it's on prime location or ask questions then. But
So is it the same easement? So they haven't budged? I mean, did they change on the easement that they wanted, or is it the same easement that they wanted?
they have, since the original, when we started discussions with them, that it has changed.
Okay.
Yes.
And I don't know, it might be too soon to tell, but if you could give any insight. So does the MRCA easement have any impacts on the city's ability to potentially do things there?
Again, within the easement area, that there would be restrictions. The easement agreement will state what type of activities would be allowed within that easement area. Mm-hmm. So if the city wants to perform a project within the easement area that conforms with the restrictions of the easement agreement, we could then approach MRCA to propose a joint project within that easement area. Within the area that's outside of the easement area, the city is still free to do whatever the city wants in that area.
So are those easement from MRCA, the uses for that easement, has that been determined yet, or?
Yes, we have a draft list of uses that would be allowed within that easement area. Okay. And when we come forward with those agreements, you'll see them listed there.
So obviously we're fighting for the most maximum flexibility on those, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll look forward to seeing that.
All right, thank you.
And that brings back the question of exclusive use. So in negotiations, then, if MRCA is demanding some sort of exclusive use, and from their perspective, it also makes sense to us, then the question might become, okay, exclusive use for how long? Because ultimately, we want to negotiate what's best in the city's best interests, not as an adversary to the state agency, but in partnership with. And that's why I keep coming back to, if we're going to agree for an exclusive use of perhaps the most attractive portion of the 41.485 acres, then the details have to be reasonable and also in the city's best interests. And let me also say, colleagues, we talk about enhanced infrastructure financing district all the time, or at least I do, and that's winning its way forward for the river. And one of the main components of an EIFD is brownfield remediation. And so we're going to discover, I think, in future years that the vision we have for the river and bringing people to the river and restoring its habitat, we're going to be seeing a lot of brownfield issues in the coming years because of all the heavy industrial use, especially as you get closer to the urban core, which to me is another justification for an EIFD along the Los Angeles River. Otherwise, we simply won't have a continual revenue source to address these needs as they arise. So, all right, any other questions, comments? Thank you. So we look forward to the written report then, and we'll bring you, invite you back to committee in 30 days or 6 weeks or whatever the timeline makes sense. And we appreciate all of the work you're doing in relation to the negotiations for the G2 parcel.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your work.
All right, thank you.
All right, Mr. Sutton-Willis, we have no other cards on any other items, and that completes all the items on today's agenda. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.